Welcome to Minerva Meets. I'm your host, Sonal Chandler, and this is episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about human-centered design. And to help me break down this concept, I've brought Hugh Musick to the show. Hugh is Assistant Vice Chancellor at the Office of Population Health Sciences. He is also Director at the Institute of Healthcare Delivery Design at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Hugh has served on 2 boards as an advisory member, and he was also Associate Dean and Director of Executive Education at IIT Institute of Design. Welcome to the show, Hugh. I'm so happy that you can join us today.
Thank you, Sonal.
So today we are going to be talking about human-centered design, and I was, obviously exposed to it from working with you in the past, and wanted to really dig a little bit deeper to give our listeners a little bit of background about human-centered design and how it's being leveraged in our society really today. And Hugh, you've got a background, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how you got started.
Thanks. So Sonal, my entire career has really been in the innovation and new product development space. I started very early on in educational products, textbooks, but right at the cusp of the formation of the internet when the World Wide Web first became available. And so was doing some of the very first interactive educational products. I went from there to a consumer products company where I was responsible for putting products that you would find in places like Crate and Barrel or Bed Bath & Beyond. And I put out about 1,000 products just when the global supply chain was really taking off in the 90s. So I had an opportunity to see that whole revolution and sort of fast production. I then turned to the world of academia, where I took what I'd been doing for most of my professional life and started to interact with people who were doing it more from an academic perspective. And so ended up at Illinois Institute of Technology's Institute of Design, which was really, for people who are familiar with design and design thinking, it's really where all of the cornerstones of the practice began. There's a much longer history about the formation of the Institute of Design that really goes back to the Bauhaus, which was the most formative design school really in the Western canon, created in Germany in 1900, shuttered in 1937 with the rise of Nazism, and reconstituted in the United States as the new Bauhaus. The new Bauhaus then subsequently becoming the Institute of Design when it merged with Illinois Institute of Technology in 1947.
Wow. Okay.
But what the Bauhaus did was arose at a moment in time when products that occupied people's homes, things like furniture or dinnerware, things like that, went from being made by artisans to being mass produced.
Mm.
And then what happened during the course of the 20th century, in particular in the post-war years, is manufacturing scaled up, and the world really became defined by production engineers who became very good at producing at scale and at large volume to drive down the price to make goods available to greater numbers of people. What happened eventually by the 80s or 90s, right when I was really beginning my career, was that manufacturers could basically produce whatever they wanted, but what they didn't really know is what it was that people wanted. So what we ended up seeing was a lot more incrementalism, sort of surface styling of things, and a proliferation of goods without a real clear sense of what it was that people wanted. Human-centered design then went back to the roots of the Bauhaus about really connecting artisan values with what technology could produce to think about further up that chain, what is it that people want?
Very interesting. So if you had to give a definition of human-centered design, would that be it, or would you sort of go into a little bit more detail?
What I would say is human-centered design is any product that is decided upon through a process of really understanding people's needs. And that's not seen through the lens of the person who's going to produce the product,
Mm-hmm.
of sort of pushing it out into the world and looking for validation, but through a process of discovery. Human-centered design in the mid 1980s started to incorporate a lot from the social sciences, in particular anthropology, and conducting ethnographies, really going out and observing everyday life to see people going about their days, to understand where they were encountering friction and the identification of those friction points being expressing unarticulated needs. And then once that had been identified, engaging them in a process of co-creation and development to arrive at something that wasn't sort of made outside of them and sort of forced onto them, but really reflective of what it was that they were seeking. And that's what we mean by human-centered design. Is it really begins with needs that have been identified in as objective a way as possible.
That's really interesting. And I like the emphasis of focusing on the needs of the end user. So, when I was doing research for this episode, every time I looked up human centered design, right next to it would be design thinking. So, it got me thinking, wait a minute, are human centered design and design thinking the same thing?
People can use them interchangeably, but here's how I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Human-centered design is a discipline. It's a field for understanding what we might do, how we might go forward to figure out what a need is. Design thinking are the activities that constitute human-centered design. So that includes being able to initially frame a problem and then to test that initial frame by going out and talking to people and doing direct observation. It entails doing analysis of qualitative information to arrive at an insight about what might be an unarticulated or, until that moment, an unidentified need, and framing that as the need that needs to be met. So that is a reframing of the problem. So reframing is a key component of what constitutes design thinking. And then what you have is prototyping. And prototyping, for many people, they think it's about making the finished thing. In the world of human-centered design, prototyping is a method for interrogating possibilities. You want relatively low fidelity prototypes because you want to draw out from your potential beneficiaries of the idea what they think would work for them. So it's a process of failing fast and failing early to elicit input to refine the idea to a point where it really does meet the intended need.
Gotcha. So, you said failing fast, which immediately makes me think of agile, right? And when we think about how software development happens, would it be correct to say that human-centered design can be injected into software development, or is it really agile that is being leveraged, or is it both?
I think it's both, and it's something in addition to that. So there is agile, which is really an engineering and production process for coming up with something. And what you're doing is you're testing with users, you're failing often. But I think of agile as primarily engineering driven. A lot of agile now incorporates in it a form of design called user experience or UX design. And so I think that there are many aspects of human-centered design that are baked into the agile process, but the agile process really has as its goal the production of an item. And so it's about the output. And I would say human-centered design in its most aspirational is really trying to think less about the product and more about the people and the need. Does it really, at the end of the day, scratch the itch that people want to have relieved?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And when, again, as I was looking into the background of human-centered design, there were some modern examples of how it's reshaped technology development. So really sort of taking this lens and focusing on user-friendly design and software gadgets. So things like the smartphone and the accessibility features on a smartphone, or the wearable health devices, or voice activated assistants. Those are just some examples of human-centered design application. And wanted to understand if you had any thoughts on any of those specific examples.
Yeah, but and if you can humor me, I'm going to actually relate it to the world that I play in right now, which is healthcare delivery.
Sure, yeah, please.
So you can think of software, and you can think of the development of a product being really governed by process. And a lot of people are very much focused on how we get this done. So in the world of healthcare, it's how do we bring in patients? How do we ensure that they receive the care that they need? How do we get them out of the clinic, get them to pick up their medication, basically get onto the path of health and a sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So there are people who spend a lot of time very much focused on that process as an operation.
Okay.
In addition to that, once that's sort of been blueprinted or the schematic for a process has been outlined, so in software about how it's going to develop, how it's going to be used, et cetera, you then have to consider how is it going to be used by people. So if your process is your blueprint, you then have to think about the analogy of there being the person who has to take the blueprint and convert it into an actual building that people have instructions that they can follow and do. So then you think about the people and how are the people going to engage with and interact with that process. That's sort of the basis of human-centered design. And when you think about whenever people and processes intersect with one another, it results in people having experiences. Okay. They're carrying out some part of the process.
Right.
From A to B.
Right.
And how they carry that out in itself can be more or less user-friendly.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work that we do in healthcare is to think about designing for experience. But ultimately, it's really not that different than thinking about the ease with which you can turn on your mobile phone and you don't need to have a background in computer engineering to navigate it and use it. You can watch 2.5-year-olds navigate phones.
Right.
And that's because over the course of the last 30 to 40 years, a lot of focus in the technology sector has really given a lot of thought to usability. If you're someone as old as me, when I went to college, PCs were just getting off the ground, but it required people to know a programming language called DOS. And then in 1984, Apple came out with the first Macintosh computer, which had a graphical user interface. That had actually been developed way earlier at Xerox PARC, but wasn't widely available. But Steve Jobs had an opportunity to see it. Xerox didn't really think that there was much of a market there. And he saw an opportunity to sort of make computing accessible to everybody. So human-centered design writ large is trying to do what Steve Jobs did with the Macintosh computer, which is make things more usable so that everybody can benefit from the development of improvements in technologies, services, experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's just super exciting, right? Because your example of a 2-year-old being able to navigate a smartphone as well as, an 80-year-old. Right. The range is just, it's amazing, right? That there's something for everyone because the design was really thought through and how the usability of the specific product would carry out in the real world versus just sort of throwing something out there, right? We talked about how human-centered design is impacting technology and design. What about like in natural business storefronts and customer service protocols and like subscription services? I know those are some newer areas, well, not newer, but these are areas that are not necessarily technical. They might leverage technology, but are you seeing a trend in how human-centered design is impacting businesses?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say this is a case that because people had phones that work for them, or were able to navigate the internet more easily, or if you can even think about what shopping used to be like 20 years ago versus Amazon's one-click ability to shop and navigate, there has now grown up in the world an expectation that the world just work better for people. I would say you really know that usability became the cost of doing business when, certainly here in Illinois, you had the Department of Motor Vehicles redesigning the process by which people renewed their licenses, which used to be an excruciating, bureaucratic, inhuman process that people were subjected to. And now, certainly here in Illinois, it moves very quickly and very efficiently. And they recognized that there was no reason why it had to be so painful for people.
Yeah, well, that's a great example, by the way. And it makes me sometimes wonder, why aren't more people embracing it? And so, what are some of those barriers to leveraging human-centered design? Is it staff? Is it knowledge? What is it?
So a person named Patrick Whitney was the dean of Illinois Institute of Technology's, the Institute of Design, for 36 years.
Okay.
And Patrick's a big thinker in design. And he always said that companies only come to design when there are one of two conditions. They're feeling fear or they're feeling pain.
Oh, okay.
So fear might come because there has been the arrival in the marketplace of a competitive good that does a better job or will attract and pull customers away from them. Fear is about, it sort of arises from a very similar idea about the fear of becoming irrelevant, or that the world has moved on and what you've become expert and very efficient at making is no longer giving you the dividends that you want. Right. So if you become very good at mass producing very large gas guzzling automobiles, but what people are driving now are, and increasingly driving, are electric vehicles, that use different materials, you have these very heavy capital investments that you've made in continuing to do the same thing, and the world is going somewhere else. It's very difficult for you to pivot, but you know that if you don't pivot, you risk obsolescence. And so it's often said that design became relevant because we live today in a world that's described as VUCA, and it's a military term that sort of described the state of the world. And VUCA is an acronym for volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous.
Oh, wow. Okay. VUCA. I just learned a new term today then. Well, that makes sense. That completely makes sense why, that's sort of the reasons why people would start embracing human-centered design. In your background, you're in healthcare. Can you give me a few examples of how human-centered design has impacted healthcare? And I know you've championed some projects that have been super fascinating, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about those.
Sure. So the Institute for Healthcare Delivery Design at University of Illinois at Chicago is really dedicated to thinking about the delivery of health and social services in a way that is user-friendly and works better for people. When you do anything at scale, it's very challenging to do it well. I mean, the world of consumer packaged goods has gotten very good at being able to deliver consistent product. And for all of the criticisms that can be leveled against an organization like McDonald's, has remarkably consistent product anywhere you go in the world. And that's no small achievement. When you're trying to deliver social services or healthcare to people, everybody who walks through the door is a customer who needs or wants something slightly different. And it's very difficult to scale that up. But for example, about 5 years ago, someone in the state of Illinois came and said, for decades, we've been pouring money into healthcare systems, but we really haven't seen improvements in health outcomes, in particular in minority communities. And the range of health disparities is unacceptable. We need to try to do something differently, but we can't sort of get out of our own way. In some ways, it's very similar to the example that I just gave of an automobile manufacturer. The healthcare apparatus was set up to, based on a model decades old and now had difficulty pivoting. So the Institute for Healthcare Delivery Design came in and said, well, to really understand how we might best serve those communities, let's go out and find out what the data is telling us about who's being hospitalized, where, for what, so that we could have a solid empirical understanding of the extent of disparities and where those disparities were greatest here in Illinois. And then in addition to that, what we said is, but the data is only going to tell us one sort of side of the story. We actually need to go into communities and understand how people are experiencing health and how they go about doing that. So the second part of our work was actually to partner with trusted community-based organizations and to give them guidance in how to conduct interviews in communities to really get a sense of what mattered to people with regard to their healthcare. And so we got in to complement sort of the quantitative picture, a qualitative picture of what was happening. And it was through the investigation of these two things that we did what human-centered design or design thinking really has at its heart, which is understanding context. And so when we began to understand the context of why people had such difficulty accessing healthcare, and it was pretty straightforward stuff. For example, if you were someone with diabetes and you live in rural Illinois, you would have to drive an average of 3 hours to end up at a healthcare system that would have an endocrinologist who could see you about your diabetes. So there are actual healthcare deserts. So being able to arrive at, well, there's a high prevalence of diabetes, type 2 diabetes in certain rural communities, but there's a lack of service provision. We were able to sort of frame what might be done. And what we tried to do was say, healthcare systems have been entrusted with trying to figure out this problem, but they've been working in a vacuum, not really knowing their customers. So we proposed to the state a collaborative approach that would bring together communities and healthcare systems to work on those conditions that were most frequent and resource intensive. And so that led to the governor signing into law the healthcare transformation bill here in Illinois. It allocated $1 billion over 7 years for the formation of these healthcare transformation collaboratives, which is basically a pilot study. So it created the space for large institutions to have the breathing room, a sandbox to try to do something different. We don't know how these things ultimately are going to work or not, but it's at least created the space to try to do something new and different and to learn from it. And hopefully, if what can be learned can then be scaled ultimately for the benefit of people in need.
Absolutely. And it started the dialogue too, right? The communication between these communities and these organizations to try to solve the problem. So have they gone back and I'm assuming that they have gone back and done some more measurements to see if there have been some improvements, and can you speak to that a little?
So, these things are still very much in their infancy. And, the other thing to understand, unlike agile development, is the pace of change in state government or federal government is glacial in comparison.
Right, absolutely.
And so these things are just being tested. And so right now, some initial reporting is going to be done, less for hardcore metrics, but to see how far people have progressed in establishing the conditions to allow for some of these experiments to take off. So we're hoping in the next few years to see more, but it's still very early.
Sure, that's amazing. When you and I were prepping for this episode, you were telling me about the telehealth example, and I'd love for you to tell our audience a little bit more about that. But then also, I think there was also another example around patient portals that you were telling me about as well. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on the telehealth example, I'd love for our audience to hear that.
Sure. So March of 2020, basically the world closed down because of COVID, and for people needing specialty care, whether they had diabetic retinopathy and needed to see an ophthalmologist or a cardiologist or whatever, it became very difficult to do. And people were being actively discouraged from going in. And a lot of places were not seeing outpatients. So that was a boon for telehealth. And what you saw was broad adoption across the country of telehealth appointments. And so the Institute for Healthcare Delivery Design was asked to think about the University of Illinois at Chicago's telehealth strategy for its hospital and outpatient clinics, and really just its outpatient care. And we did a lot of investigation. We talked to a lot of providers. We talked to a lot of patients. And across the board, everybody said that they loved telehealth. It reduced burden from a patient's perspective of having to come in and find parking and take time off from work. For providers, they were able to focus a lot more without all the distractions in a clinic and really listen to their patients. And so everybody thought that it was terrific. The issue was there's a third party in the background that became a very important part of this, and that's insurance companies or payers. And the issue was that as the pandemic started to recede, the reimbursement rate for a telehealth appointment was just a fraction of what they would be reimbursed for an in-person visit. So you had a case of something that both doctors and patients preferred. They actually thought that it was a superior form of delivering a lot of the kinds of care that don't require actually laying their hands on a patient. And yet, because there wasn't the financial incentives for doing so, ultimately, the ability to adopt this much more user-friendly way of conducting outpatient care could not move forward at present because the payers aren't willing to pay at parity. So, this then becomes an issue ultimately that moves beyond healthcare systems and needs to be addressed through policy. And, that becomes very complex and it requires efforts on all parties' parts. But here's something clearly that people want that's being impeded because you have a player who feels no incentive to actually do right by people.
Well, I've got my opinion on payers, but that's a whole other episode. And I'm sure you and I share some similar thoughts on that. But yeah, wow, what an interesting example, right? And I just wanted to actually go back to the healthcare transformation bill that the governor signed in Illinois. Is that also being mirrored across other states? Or are you seeing some of that? Are other states reaching out and saying, "Hey, let's collaborate on this," or is it more of an Illinois thing?
Right now, it's in Illinois. We're just beginning to sort of go out and tell our story more broadly. And we're hoping in the next couple of years to take the lessons that we've learned and bring them elsewhere. There are a lot of conditions necessary for that to happen. You need to have leadership in state agencies who feel the similar sort of passion that was felt here in Illinois to do better by our people. And I think if you have leaders who are really committed to doing so and they have the support of their governors, that's how these sorts of things will be able to scale up. And again, I'm very uncomfortable around a lot of what I call innovation fiction about how the world changes. The world changes very slowly. Even many things that are considered breakthrough technologies existed a very long time.
AI is one of them, right? Like people are acting like it's just something brand new. It's been around for ages. Right?
Yeah. So I think it requires patience. It requires bringing people along. It requires being able to find middle ground, and right now in this moment in US history, there's a lot of polarization. But if we're going to do better as societies, we really need to come together to address these sorts of issues.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. So if I wanted to embrace human-centered design in my organization, what's a good way to get started? I mean, do I just sort of dive in, feet first, or is there a methodology or a process that I should follow to sort of see what the appetite is and how my organization can embrace it?
Yeah. So I've always said that, it takes under an hour to teach anybody the principles of design, but design is learned by doing.
Mhm.
And actually, based on my decades of engagement with design, it works best as sort of an apprentice model. It's best to embed with people who are actually practitioners
Mhm.
who can show you what to do. A lot of the design itself has nothing to do with the idea. We spend far more time trying to understand the problem.
Right.
It's and depending on the situation. So in companies, there can be frustration with the process because it can seem like a lot of dithering and a lot of exploring without any definitive sort of resolution.
Mhm.
But design spends most of its time making sure it's understood and identified the problem that's really worth solving.
Uh,
So, the best thing, there are lots of good courses out there
mhm.
that will introduce you to the fundamentals, but I would encourage you to find people who have decades of experience to work with them.
Mhm.
Then you need to also understand that, I think for many people who have had sort of the traditional liberal arts education, it comes much more naturally to them than people who have STEM educations. But it's a process of critical thinking. What you want is a good mentor who's going to ask you questions about where you are in your process and
Mhm.
why you're thinking the way that you're thinking.
Yeah.
So it's not a neat and clean answer. You can get a master's degree in, a really good design program. Of course, my heart is still very close to Illinois Institute of Technology's Institute of Design, but Carnegie Mellon also has a wonderful program.
Mhm.
University of Michigan has a wonderful program. There are a number of very good programs that are out there. But short of that, I would say it's engaging people in a design process and not actually looking for a very tangible outcome, but
Mhm.
really engaging in a project as research and an opportunity to learn and grow.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more because I could see where organizations might struggle, right? Because you've got the time aspect, right, of needing to get something out the door, but then also the time aspect of needing the time to do the research, to do the study, to understand, how this design impacts a specific product. And I think that's a delicate balance, right? So how do you give your team time to do that research, but also trying to get something out the door so that you're not the last in the market when it comes to presenting the product. So it's a delicate balance, I think.
And it's very hard. I think the pattern that we saw over years of doing executive education
Mhm.
at the Illinois Institute of Technology's Institute of Design is that CEOs bought in and saw the value of design as the scouts going out onto the horizon to figure out, where the wagon party should
Right.
be headed.
Yeah.
And they valued that exploratory aspect of it, where design encountered friction was at the division president level of
Mm.
large consumer packaged goods companies. So let's say you're the head of a particular division, your performance as a unit head is predicated on you moving more product than you did the
Absolutely.
year before.
Yeah.
And so for you to spend your precious resources on something that's speculative is not going to help you advance or not going to earn you the bonus that you need. You're far better off doing something incremental, even
Mm-hmm.
if that's very short-lived.
Yeah.
So this is what I've always referred to, and I know no one at Nabisco, but I refer to this as the Oreo double stuff theory of innovation. And what I've always imagined is, there was someone who was a junior product manager working on Oreos, and their boss comes to them and says, "You need to come up with a breakthrough product, but oh, by the way, within the next 18 months, it needs to be doing, $500 million in sales." So what do? You take what you already know how to make Oreos and you just put more stuff in the middle. And it's not like it's a bad strategy. It just leads to what I think of as brand pollution. So like if you now go into a store,
Oh, it's
there's like
terrible.
400 different varieties of
Oh, yeah, you get the
Oreos.
peanut butter, you get
Right.
the mint.
Yeah.
It's awful. It's awful. And then you can't even find the regular ones, right? Because they're just so clouded with all these other ones. So what a great example. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how human-centered design impacts technology and business and sort of how to get started. Where is it going? Can we speculate a little bit more on the future of human-centered design and where it's going to play when it comes to technology and business, and even healthcare, if we want to sort of hone in on a specific area.
I think if we are going to be able to deliver healthcare at scale, we're going to need technology. The pandemic resulted in lots of people leaving healthcare. It's very
Yeah,
stressful.
yeah.
We also know here in the United States that we have a major behavioral health epidemic going
Mhm.
on, high rates of anxiety, high rates of depression, hopelessness, et cetera, and not enough people to actually address the needs of other people.
Yeah.
Based on what I've read, chatbots can actually be helpful.
Oh, interesting.
Not for everything, but at least for some, certain types of general anxiety. If someone needs to be seen or needs to be hospitalized, that's another thing. But
Right.
chatbots can actually identify some of the degrees of severity that a person is expressing in their responses to prompts to them. So I would hope that as technologies evolve, AI technologies, that they become assistive in
Mhm.
ways that can help either triage people more effectively and efficiently in the healthcare space, but
Mhm.
also be able to provide some comfort to people in ways that we currently can't just because we don't have enough people doing the work. So I have some hope that we can get there. I think that here at University of Illinois at Chicago, we have a new center that's very much focused on artificial intelligence and machine learning for health equity.
Oh,
So
wow.
we understand that bias can be expressed in even how code is written that
Yeah.
can be exclusionary, and this center is set up to counter that and to make sure that we have much more equitable healthcare available to people. So I actually am very supportive of that vision and want to see that advance. Within the world of business, I don't know. I mean, we're both at a very terrifying time and also a very hopeful time.
Yeah.
And if we're going to address how we live in a warming world, it's going to take a lot of new ideas and doing things differently.
Yeah.
And we could go about that in a very ad hoc way by trial and error, or we can be much more intentional and thoughtful in the way that we go about doing it. Human-centered design is a way to do it in a much more thoughtful way. So I think that this can begin to change how we consume, how we live our daily lives, and also just how we can feel hopeful about the future and not sort of feel like the sky is falling.
I agree. And I actually have a lot of faith in this up and coming generation because they're very experience driven. And I hope to see that that way of thinking will soon permeate into how they work, how they develop things, how they approach things. And it really makes me hopeful that will see that trend embedded in everything that they do as they get older and start entering the workforce.
I share your hope.
Well, as we wrap up here, I wanted to give our listeners some key points about human-centered design. And what I'm taking away from this conversation is that first and foremost, the user experience is critical and basically the core of human-centered design. And I think another takeaway I heard was that the collaboration piece is critical. And human-centered design actually thrives on this interdisciplinary collaboration and, trying to ensure that all stakeholders not only understand the end goal, but also the path to get there. What's that roadmap? And then finally, you mentioned that human-centered design takes patience. And I think that being able to measure progress and outcomes, as well as being willing to continuously improve, both contribute to patience because it allows you to see progress, especially when it might feel like progress isn't being made.
What I would say is what unites the last 2 points that you brought up is bringing all the stakeholders along. We can't have solutions that just work for some people, that productivity requires different people doing different things, and for there to be alignment and efficiency in the ability to get from here to there, everybody sort of needs to be rowing in the same direction.
Yeah.
So there's another part of design which we didn't really talk about, but that's thinking about communication, and not communication as an afterthought, but communication as integral to this entire process. So being able to articulate a shared mental model of what it is that everybody's trying to achieve, being honest about where there are points of difference, and being able to reconcile and find at least some consensus.
Yeah.
And then being able to say to everybody, are we okay with moving toward this vision of the future?
Absolutely. That's such a critical point that I think we should spend a few minutes on it. I think that when it comes to any type of initiative, regardless of the methodology or process being utilized, communication is key. Can you give me some examples of how you've communicated a shared model in the past? Because some of the stakeholders that your organization deals with are fairly complex and there's several layers. So what's worked for you guys? What hasn't worked? Can you share a little bit more?
So all of our work follows the same general process because we are dealing with so many different constituencies, disciplines, people touching, different parts of the elephant, that it's critical to bring everybody together. But I can give a concrete example. So here in Illinois, there is in the court system an option for people with severe mental illness to avoid long-term hospitalization by appearing before a judge and making a determination for assisted outpatient treatment, AOT. And through that mechanism, a person can say, yes, I understand that I have severe mental illness. I will agree to my medication and receiving community-based service. And in doing so, can then receive treatment in the community and continue to live with their families, or, not be confined. The process involves the courts, it involves service providers, it involves healthcare system experts. It generally also involves law enforcement, because if some people are having episodes, law enforcement is brought in. And when we were brought in to understand the issue, what we saw very clearly was no one understood what the process was as a whole. So we brought together 25 or 30 people into one room. We spent 5 hours saying, what is this assisted outpatient treatment? And we got 25 different perspectives on what it was. And no one could even really articulate what it was. But through that process of bringing them together and listening to them, we were then able to sort of distill everything we heard into a flow diagram that said sort of, this is where it begins. This is sort of the middle of it. This is what it looks like on the far side of this. And this is how all of the different actors interact with the system. We then brought that entire group back and we did another 5 or 6 hours with them to say, based on what we've heard, this is the way that we think that it works. And we had general consensus finally about, yeah, but boy, I really don't understand. People would say, I really don't understand what happens when it gets into the courts because
Right.
I'm over here working in an emergency department. And so through that exercise of simply bringing people together and
Yeah.
listening to one another, we were activating a core value of design, which is empathy.
Yeah.
And by empathy, what we mean is, oh, yeah, I really hear you and feel you. No, we try to understand how people see the world and think about the world and why their worldview is what it is, and use that as a basis for figuring out how they want to engage in this entire process, how they need to.
Yeah, that's a great example. And it also gives visibility to the entire process, or perhaps part of the process that they had zero knowledge of, that really helps start building that empathy for one another and what each of them has to go through in that process. I know we've gone over our time here, but I'm really glad that we took some time to talk about communication and empathy. There's so much more that I want to dig into around human-centered design, so I'm going to have you back on the show, Hugh. I want to thank you again for being on the show and sharing your knowledge and expertise on human-centered design. I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners where they can find you, and we'll also add it to the show notes.
I am on LinkedIn, and you can look up the Institute for Healthcare Delivery Design at University of Illinois at Chicago, and find our website that way. But thank you for this opportunity, Sunil. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I also want to remind our listeners that if they're interested in starting dialogue about human-centered design, then they can contact us at let's talk at minervaconsultinginc.com, or you can go to our website at minervaconsultinginc.com. And finally, I have 3 quick and easy next steps for our listeners before we sign off. First, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a new episode. Second, please leave a rating. And finally, please add a comment. I promise you that I read all of them. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again on our next episode.